up, guys? Nick Wisdom with HeliDirect here to talk to you about something a little bit different. Today we're going to talk about what's not in this box, but not just this box, any electric helicopter kit. So when you're approaching your first electric helicopter kit build, maybe you don't know what doesn't come with most helicopters. And there's some exceptions along the way, and we'll talk about those when we get there. In this case, this is a Tron Advanced 700 size electric helicopter that is about to hit my build table. And while I had all of the things that I've purchased to go in the build, I thought perhaps I'd do a video about what it takes to put one of these together and all of the extra things you'll need to pick up and purchase. So let's get rid of the kit and let's dig into what's on the table here. All right, with the kit out of the way, let's dig into the electronics, and we're going to go ahead and start with the motor, which is kind of the heart of the helicopter first. In my case, I chose an Ego Drift motor for my helicopter. And let's take a look and see what comes in the box here. So you get some stickers and a certificate, but if you look at the motor itself and take a close look, you'll notice that there's no connectors on the end of the motor leads. It's just bare wire. So you're going to go ahead, and the first thing you're going to need outside of the motor are the motor connections. Now, in the case of Ego Drift motors, they actually come with them, which is great. And these are typically called bullet style connectors, and they come in two parts. If I can pull these apart here. All right, here we go. Now, if you look at these are brass motor connections. There's a male and female here that will seat together like so. And that's what makes your three main motor connections on the three motor leads that'll connect between the motor and your speed control. So in the case of an Ego Drift motor, your motor bullets are included. Check in with your motor manufacturer. It should be listed in the description as to whether they include motor bullets or not. So, motor, stick that aside. All right, next up, electronic speed control. In super simple terms, the job of the speed control is to regulate the speed of the motor such that the desired RPM is reached on the main rotor head. Now, I went ahead and purchased a Hobbywing 130, which is 130 amp rated speed control for my 700. And I went with Hobbywing, certainly of great value for price, great features, great telemetry. I'm a big fan of these. Now, you'll notice, just like on the motor, these are the leads that will connect to the motor, these three, that these are also bare wire. So we'll need those connections, those motor bullets that came with our motor here in this case, or you had to order separately if your motor doesn't come with them, to connect between the speed control and the motor. If we look at the battery side, the flight battery side of your speed control, you'll notice there's bare wire there as well. So now we need battery connectors because we need to be able to connect our speed control to our flight packs. So what I have here is a set of Spectrum IC5 connectors for the ESC. Now, why do I use IC5s? There's a million battery connectors, so we could do a whole video just on those between IC5, EC5, XT60, Super X connectors. There's a million great choices. No one is particularly right, other than maybe using the same ones as your buddies. Means you can borrow their chargers if you need to. But this is what works for me. It's what I like to use, so I have those connectors on hand, so I can go ahead and solder to those. Incidentally, they're way easier to solder than EC5s if you use those, so definitely check out those connectors if you need to, but make sure you have those. Those are definitely never included with the ESC. Okay, so that's it as far as connectors for our ESC, but what else do we need to go with the ESC? Well, this is the Hobbywing ESC Programmer. Now, what we use it for is the ESC ships from the factory with specific firmware on it, and often these sit on the shelf for some amount of time before they're sold, and there may be a new version of firmware out or new software for the ESC, and it is generally preferred to be on the latest and greatest to get the best features out of your speed control. So if you want to update the firmware on here, you'll need some kind of programmer or external interface, whether it's just a USB interface and your speed control connects directly to a computer. In the case of Hobbywing, you need a Hobbywing ESC programmer. This also lets you change various parameters on the ESC. Now, some radios have programming such that you can actually program the ESC from the radio. Hobbywing does that with some radio systems right now. But for some radio systems, you'll need the external programmer to be able to program the speed control. So you do this to turn off the brake. So there's, these speed controls work in airplanes and helicopters, and there's some certain features you would toggle one way or the other depending on the application. So definitely you'll need an ESC programmer as well. The good news is once you buy it, it works for all the ESCs in the Hobbywing brand. So you've got one. If you stick with that brand, then you'll never have to buy one again. If you're like me and you like to try lots of ESCs, you've got a Hobbywing programmer, you've got the YGE USB interface, you've got, any number of additional interfaces as well at home. All right, next up, we've got flight batteries here. In my case here, I've chosen Pulse 4500 milliamp 6S packs. I'm going to put them together in series to get me a 12S 4500 milliamp pack. Now that does mean I'm going to have to extend the back battery on the battery tray with a little bit of wire extensions that I'll solder on, but that's no big deal. You can also purchase 12S stick packs if that's what you're looking for a 700 size helicopter from Pulse as well. Let's say you're using a raw 580, Nimbus 550, and you're using just a single 6S pack. You can purchase these Pulse packs with the EC5 connector already on it, which I love because it's just easy. And if I don't have to solder, I'm lazy like that. And then they're good to go. They also come obviously in different size packs for different size helicopters, all the way down to micro helicopters. So do make sure you pick up some flight batteries for that. How many you buy depends on how you like to fly and charge. I personally prefer to have 3 sets of packs for all the helicopters that I fly. That way I can have, 1 or 2 on the charger and then 1 flying, and I can keep them rotating regularly and stay in the air when I get a chance to get a lot of flights in. All right, that's our flight batteries. Moving on electronics-wise, Flybarless unit, the center of the helicopter control system. This is the box that will link up to your radio either via an inbuilt antenna or an external antenna, link to your transmitter, and translate the signals from your transmitter into actions and movements for your servos and your speed control. In my case, I fly the Mikado V control system. This is a V-Bar Neo. We don't sell these here at HeliDirect, but I'm a big fan of these. This is the old school Neo, not the newer Neo Evo version. But that doesn't matter. Whatever Flybarless you use, whether it's an Icon or a Spirit or a CGY 760 from Futaba, whatever it is, doesn't matter. Just make sure you have a Flybarless unit and do pick up an external antenna or antennas, satellite antennas if needed for your system. So check with your radio manufacturer and the Flybarless manufacturer on that. But pick up one of those. All right. Next in line for electronics are our servos. Now these are the little tiny motors, precision motors I should say, that get mounted inside your servo that translate the control signals from your radio and Flybarless unit into actions for the linkages that actually move the swash plate and in turn adjust the pitch of your helicopter. Now servos in general come in 3 different sizes. They are typically full-size servos, mini-size servos, which are generally on the 5 to 600 size helicopter, and then micro servos, which are often on the 380 and smaller size helicopters in the smallest size class of servo. So definitely look up whatever helicopter kit you'll be building to see which size servos it needs and how many. Keep in mind, especially when you get to the mid-size 5 to 600 size helicopters, it's common to see mini servos in the helicopter and a full-size servo on the tail. So definitely make sure you're purchasing the correct ones. We sell a lot of different brands from Theta, KST, Expert, Torque. I'm sure I'm missing a bunch there, but they're all great. Honestly, any of the name brands that we or most major retailers sell are great and are totally fine to go with. I would avoid the cheap stuff you can find online at some of the giant sites like Amazon, etc. But go with a quality name brand servo, you're going to have a great experience. In my case, I like to go with programmable servos, which is why I like this particular line of Theta servos. So as you're purchasing servos, you might want to think about being able to program them. And depending on the manufacturer, you often need an external box to do that. So Torque, KST, and in this case Thetas all have external programming boxes you can use to program the servo. So you may want to pick up one of these programmers, and what I can do with this is I can adjust the center point of the servo. So if once I put the servo arm, it doesn't quite go exactly where I want, it's not dead 90 degrees to the body of the servo, for example, at 0 pitch, I could actually adjust that center point here in the servo itself. So that I don't have to use any sub-trim or other features in my Flybarless unit. So, handy little programmer if that's of interest to you. So, as we're looking at servos here, we've got our 3 cyclics. All right, let's not forget we need a tail servo as well. Again, check with the manufacturer of the helicopter as to which size. This is the Theta Razor T1, an excellent all-around tail servo with a very reasonable price point. There's also plenty of other great tail servos from other manufacturers. Big fan of the Futaba ones as well. So make sure you pick one of those up. Now, while we are talking about servos, let's talk about servo horns. So servo horns is just a little piece of, and again, the materials vary. They're either plastic or a composite that's a mix of plastic and some milled fibers that make up the servo horn, or there's some full aluminum ones. They all have pluses and minuses. The cheap plastic ones that come with most servos are typically no good. They're fine for an airplane or a light duty application, but the forces inside a helicopter, especially if you're flying 3D, are pretty significant, and the cheaper servo horns just are brittle and can break, especially when exposed to the sun for a long time. So don't recommend those. These particular servo horns are the SAB servo horns. I'm a big fan of these. They're a composite material, so a mix of various fibers and plastics. They're very strong, but they're designed to break under extreme force in a crash. So if you crash your helicopter, these servo horns break, which when the blades get forced into an awkward position, that transitions down the linkage towards the servo. And if your servo horn doesn't break, typically your servo gears will get stripped and you're going to have to repair the servo or replace it. So the servo horn sacrificing itself is a really inexpensive part and easy part to replace versus replacing all the gears in your servo. So using a high quality servo horn is a great choice. I should also add that the Theta Sabre line of servos, so the C1 and T1, come with a great composite servo horn, very similar to the SAB ones, which is a fine choice. That's actually what I'll probably run on the helicopter. The SAB ones are another great choice. Super big fan of these. I don't personally recommend the aluminum ones because, again, like I said, I find that they don't get out of the way fast enough. Some of them claim they'll bend and save your servo gears, but to me, it's not worth taking the risk. I don't want to deal with servo gear replacement. All right, almost done with electronics. Just one minor thing left. This here is a digital pitch gauge. Now, what we use this for is we level our swash plate using our Flybarless software to do that. And then from there, once the swash is level, we need to adjust the linkages such that the blades are at zero pitch. And we do this so that the tracking of the blades, meaning the tip of the blade, if everything is level, rotates through the same point that the other tip of the other blade just went through as well. If there's a big difference there, the tips aren't tracking well, you actually get a lot of vibration through the helicopters and some negative flying characteristics. So, want to get the tracking right, which means we need to get our zero pitch right. You just slide this right over the end of the blade. There's a digital readout here that'll give you the angle of pitch. This is an RC Logger unit, sadly no longer made because it's a really good one, but there's plenty of other good choices available on the market as well. Definitely pick up one of those. All right, speaking of some specialty tools. Now, every helicopter, or not every, but a lot of helicopters often require specific tools that are custom to that helicopter for whatever reason. Now, some manufacturers like SAB tend to include them in the kit. So SAB includes the boom tensioning tool on the raw series of helicopters. They include a ball link tool to help put the ball links on the link rods, and some other tiny little tools that they build into the kits for you. Some helicopters just need some specialty tools that you probably wouldn't otherwise necessarily have in your selection. So some helicopters on the main gear is held in place by what's called a split ring clamp, and you'll need a special set of split ring pliers to put those on and off. In the case of the Tron Advanced that I'm building, there's a couple of tiny little nuts in the tail assembly that require a special tool. Now, it's only a 7mm socket wrench, but the thing is it's really narrow at the tip, and 99% of the 7mm socket wrenches out on the market are too big to fit inside where it has to go. So I went ahead and purchased the Tron 7mm nut drivers here. Now, many YouTube reviews of helicopters, especially from team guys, tend to cover things like this or recommended tools you need to pick up. So do your research before you purchase the kit, and you can figure out some things to take care of there. All right, let's talk about, now I'm not going to cover every tool you should use to build your helicopter over here. We'll talk about that perhaps in another video. But I am going to talk about some other things you will need to purchase, expendable things. So first up, epoxy. This is JB Weld brand epoxy. It dries in 5 minutes, and what I use it for is to assemble my tail pushrod. Now, some people will tell you to use, any number of different adhesives here. This stuff's never let go for me. I'm a big fan. So 5-minute epoxy or a similar adhesive for assembling your tail pushrod, or if, you have a major thing, split, a little canopy repair, having some epoxy around for that is a good idea at all times. All right. Speaking of, well, sort of glues, not really. I guess you could call thread locker an adhesive. But these three here are 3 different types of thread lockers. Now, what is a thread locker? Well, it is a special material we put onto the bolts when we have a metal-to-metal connection, so metal bolt or screw going into a metal receiving surface or nut. And what it does is the helicopter is under a lot of vibration, right? And if you just let it sit there and vibrate with no thread locker, eventually all of the screws in the helicopter will slowly back out, eventually to the point of falling out of the helicopter. And obviously when all the screws come apart, your helicopter falls apart and crashes, and that's terrible. So to prevent that, we use what's called a thread locker. So we put a couple, like a drop of this in the threads, working into the threads. And what happens is when you tighten your bolts, the thread locker forms. It's not quite an adhesive because you can actually remove the bolts afterwards, but it adds a lot of friction such that the bolts will not vibrate out. They won't back out as you run the helicopter. Now, this comes in a few different types for a few different applications. Now, these are all HeliDirect brand. Well, Loctite is kind of a common term. These are all HeliDirect thread lockers. There are several brands. Loctite's a great brand. Permatex is another great choice. You can find it at home centers, at auto parts stores, or at most hobby retailers and hobby shops. Now, the three types. This is blue thread locker. We use this for most of the general purpose bolts on our helicopter, frame bolts, any of the assemblies that have multiple bolts holding something in, your motor mounts, where there's 4 bolts typically holding those things in. All of that is fine. So most bolts on the helicopter will just get blue Loctite. Red Loctite offers a much stronger bond than blue, but it's much harder to remove. With blue Loctite, you just stick the driver into the bolt, crack it, and it's very easy to remove. With red, it's much harder to get that bolt removed unless you add heat in the form of holding the tip of a soldering iron to the head of the bolt or using a heat gun to heat up the surface it's into. There's some different techniques there. But it's great for mission critical bolts, right? So the little tiny set screw on the pinion on your motor is a very important little set screw. If that slips, you lose power to the helicopter. So having the ability to use red Loctite on those mission critical type bolts means that although it'll be harder to remove and you got to use heat and it's a bit of a pain, it's not going to back out on its own. I also use this on things like swash balls, right? Because the little balls that your balling's attached to on the side of the swash plate are mission critical. Also, if you ever crash so bad you destroy the swash plate, when you order a new swash plate, 99 times out of 100, they come with the swash balls as well. So it's no big deal if you can't remove them in the event of a crash. So any mission critical bolts like that, I use red Loctite on. The tail pulley set screw, the motor pinion set screw, all of my swash balls, and even my servo screws that hold the servo arm down to the servo, I put just a tiny bit of red Loctite on. I just feel a little bit safer doing that. All right, and lastly, our green thread locker, which is actually what's called retaining compound. It's not really a thread locker. So green is an almost permanent bond. Again, heat will help remove it for sure, but we use this in applications where we really want to hold something firmly and we don't want it letting go. It's almost like a glue, a very strong one. We typically use this on bearings in bearing blocks. So some manufacturers' tolerances are so tight that you just press that bearing in and it's never going to work its way out. Some manufacturers and kits tolerances are less so, and the bearing can move around a little bit. We put just a little bit of green Loctite, a little goes a long way, on the outside of the bearing such that it fuses the outside of the bearing case to the bearing block. Now we do this because we don't want it spinning, vibrating, moving around. We want these two things permanently bonded so that only the inside of the bearing moves as it should, with the shaft inside it. So that is green Loctite, green thread locker, whatever you want to call it. Bearing retaining compound is what a lot of people do. So you're going to want to make sure you have all three of those. Let's also, while we're looking at adhesives and things, look at grease or lubricants. So you're going to need a clear silicon lubricant when you're building the main rotor head and the tail rotor assembly. This grease is what goes inside around your dampeners as well as your thrust bearings, keeping everything moving very smoothly. A little goes a long way here as well. The trick is just a clear silicone grease. There's lots of brands, and there's some varieties of these, and some guys will swear by one and tell you you're crazy to use anything you want. I've had good luck with the Triflow synthetic grease, again available at home centers, at auto parts store, Amazon, all over the place. Really easy to get a hold of. Now, for a more viscous type lubrication that you would typically use on the tail shaft so that the pitch slider moves freely, as well as on the swash plate so it moves freely up and down the main shaft, is Triflow Superior Lubricant. It's just a very thin, viscous oil type lubricant. Works great. I put a little bit in the one-way bearing, depending on the type of bearing, determines the lubricant there, but typically a little bit in the one-way bearing, on the swash plate, and on my tail shaft. And it works great, and I reapply it every 5 to 10 flights, or when I tend to remember, or not as often as I should. But pick up some of that as well. All right, going back to bolts for a minute. Before we apply our thread locker, what this is a spray bottle of 99% isopropyl alcohol. It's important you get the higher concentration of alcohol because it does a much better job. But I simply spray this into a rag or a paper towel, and then I spin the bolts using a driver on them in that dampened part of the towel, and it cleans all of the oil off of the bolt that is part of the machining process is left behind on all of your screws. So if you go ahead and clean it with alcohol, let the rest of the alcohol evaporate off, which takes seconds, and then apply your Loctite, it gives you a much better bond than if you put the Loctite over the oily surface of the screw. So definitely get yourself a spray bottle or a bottle of 99% alcohol. All right, what else we got? Speaking of all things adhesive sticky thread lockers, this is a 3M product. It's a double-sided tape that is ideal for flybarless units. So I would use the alcohol here on that flybarless plate to clean it, make sure there's no oils or residues. It's going to make this tape have a much better bond. And I would go ahead and apply the tape to the flybarless unit and then undo the other side, undo this side. And if you look closely here, you can see that the thickness of the tape is such that there's actually a little bit of dampening in that system. So if it was really thin double-sided tape, it'd be a very rigid connection. But the little bit of padding here, and it's maybe only a millimeter thick, millimeter and a half, it just dampens the flybarless unit on the plate and helps, isolate some of the vibrations out of the system before they get to the flybarless. So some double-sided tape. Some flybarless units, like Mikado's, come with enough for 2 applications of the flybarless unit. I move mine around a bunch, so I like having some extra around. If your flybarless unit doesn't come with some, make sure you pick up some. All right, let's talk now about wiring a little bit. There are some odds and ends you're going to need for that. So first, we talked earlier about soldering battery connectors and motor connectors on, and when you do that, I showed you those brass fittings in there. You can't leave the exposed brass or the 3 motors leads would touch each other, right? And then they would short circuit against each other and bad things would happen. We need to isolate them electrically from each other. So we use a product called heat shrink. These are thin tubes here that will go over the wire. They come in a variety of thicknesses. And it slides over the wire, and then with the use of a heat gun, will shrink about half its original size. So it gives you a nice tight cover over everything. So anytime you're soldering battery leads or connections, a little bit of heat shrink goes a long way. Or if you have to use a servo extension in the helicopter, I like to put a little bit of heat shrink over the top of it just to stop the 2 from ever coming unplugged. So a little bit of heat shrink. This is just a variety pack from Amazon, comes in red and black, which I like so I can denote positive and negative in battery connection situations. Make sure you pick up some of that. Okay, moving on. Speaking of wiring, this is really thin 1/4-inch Velcro. Now, it's a very soft felt-like material, and it's meant for wrapping cables. So if you're coiling extension cords or doing cable management chores, like you got a bunch of wires going into your computer and you want to wrap them all together, this stuff sticks to itself Velcro-wise such that you can make little loops of it. So what I do is I cut it into small strips and I wrap it around all my servo wires or ESC wires going through the frame of the helicopter. Now, I do this both to bundle those into groups, but also everywhere I put a zip tie around the bundle of wire, I put a little bit of this under the zip tie, and that protects the wires from the hard plastic edge of the zip tie. Over time, with all the vibration in a helicopter, a zip tie can actually cut into the casing of a servo wire. So this strip, which will last you forever once you buy this, does a great job of doing that. Also works good in cleaning up your wires around your computer, charge cables, all that stuff. Speaking of zip ties, make sure you get some zip ties. Your local home center will typically have these. In a variety of sizes is nice, from beefy for perhaps holding your ESC down, as well as skinny ones for, you doing servo wires and slightly more delicate work. So get yourself some zip ties. This is 3/4-inch Velcro strips. I use this for helping hold my batteries down to battery trays. So I put it on the base of the battery on the side that'll face against the tray, and then the other side on the battery tray, Velcro them together. When you add the straps around the batteries, this gives a really nice strong bond in this situation, such that the battery packs will not move at all, which if you think about how heavy a battery pack is, you don't want it moving around your helicopter even one bit. So some good 3/4-inch Velcro. Again, I tend to buy this stuff in bulk. It's a little more expensive up front, but you save money in the long run, and you will go through it. It's my second box of this stuff. Okay, we're starting to get to the bottom of this pile of extra things. Now, I know it's a significant cost when you add all this stuff up, so it's something to think about when you're buying your first kit, all the extra costs that are not in that box. So the box is, just a small part of the cost, honestly. It's typically less than half when you put it all together. All right, it's time to talk blades now. So our main and tail blades. So The blades for a helicopter are sometimes included in the kit, as is the case with most SAB kits. Sometimes they're optionally included in the kit, like you can buy the XL Power Spectres, typically with Azure blades as an option, or without blades at all. Or some kits, just like the Tron Advance over here, don't come with any blades at all, and you get to pick out what you want. Now, the description of the helicopter itself will typically tell you the size range. In my case, this is a 700 size helicopter. I haven't looked this up, don't quote me here, but I'm going to guess that typically, 105 to 115 millimeter tail blades and 690 to 715 millimeter main blades ish. Right? So, in my case, I've got a set of RotorTech blades here to show you. So these are some RotorTech tail blades in 105 millimeter, and then I also have the RotorTech Ultimates in main blades in 715 millimeter. These are a little bit longer, which will give you a little bit of a lighter disc loading, which I tend to like. So I think this is what I'm going to go ahead and put on the Advance, but do make sure you make sure either the kit includes the blades or you go ahead and pick some up. All right, we're almost out of stuff here. Few more items. So, battery trays. The kit will typically just come with one battery tray, which if you have just one battery pack is fine. Or if you don't mind taking that battery pack off of the tray and putting another one on the tray is also fine. Most folks tend to purchase as many trays as they have batteries for the helicopter. So in my case, I like to have 3 batteries for every helicopter. So I have 2 additional trays that I've gone ahead and picked up. Now, some battery trays you buy from manufacturers also include the Velcro straps that would go around the battery. In the case of the Tron trays, they do not. So you're going to want to go ahead and order either Tron, logoed straps like come in the kit for the battery, or, Pulse or whatever other type of Velcro strap. Color straps, you can buy generic ones from some manufacturers. So make sure you pick up the battery straps as well as the battery trays. And then lastly, all I have left on the bench are some customizations. Now, one of the fun things about helicopters these days is manufacturers are realizing we don't all want to fly the same looking helicopters. So they're offering a choice of canopy colors, of boom colors. So the kit typically will come with a plain black boom, and you can purchase some fancier ones. Same thing with tail fins. They're giving these great options. Some manufacturers make blades with different colored tips, so you can kind of, make your helicopter as matchy-matchy as you want to. In my case, Tron has a fusion line of parts that they make that can dress up either the Tron 7.0 or the Advance. I purchased the Fusion tail fin with the orange sticker accents to go on the tail. I also have the Fusion side frames, which have some extra decals on the side frames. This helps makes things more visible, as just looks a little bit cooler, I think. Just add some extra color and flash here. And I also picked up the Fusion boom. Now, the nice thing about this boom is that it comes with these colored accents on it. So the stock boom is just black with this, white logo on it, whereas this one has the, brighter accents. It just makes it easier to see in the sky. I think it also looks just a little bit nicer, but visibility is really the key reason to do this. All right. With that, I think we've gone through everything on the table. So I hope this was kind of a helpful walkthrough of all the things that don't come in the box that you need to think about purchasing for your first and all of your kit builds. If you've got any questions, feel free to throw them below. Even if they're model specific, we'll try and make sure you get some help and lead you along the way. With that, I'm Nick Wisdom. Thanks for watching.
HeliDirect!